The year is 1962. At the University of Mississippi, the air hangs heavy, thick with the weight of decades of absolute exclusion. These halls stand like a fortress built of stone and iron, designed to keep a specific history in and everyone else out. For generations, the doors have remained bolted, guarded by a tradition of defiance that stretches across the entire state. Every brick in these walls serves a singular purpose: to maintain a rigid, unyielding divide. Silence here is not an absence of sound, but an active, suffocating presence. It settles into the courtyards and clings to the arched entryways, warning away any who might dare to challenge the status quo. The campus operates as its own sovereign territory, governed by a logic that rejects the changing world outside its perimeter. Pedestrians walk with eyes fixed on the pavement, avoiding any gaze that might invite change. The dust settles on the library steps, undisturbed by the feet of those deemed unwelcome. It is a place where time has been forced to stand still, protected by a network of laws and attitudes that turn every corridor into a dead end. This is the barrier. This is the fortress. And for now, the gates remain firmly locked against the approaching tide of history. A single figure steps into the frame. His name is James Meredith. He does not arrive with an army, nor does he carry the backing of a cheering crowd. He walks toward the campus perimeter with a measured, deliberate pace, his eyes locked onto the architecture of the university. He is no longer just a man pursuing a degree. He is the physical manifestation of a structural collapse. Every step he takes across the cracked asphalt of the approach is a tremor beneath the foundation of the institution. He stops at the edge of the campus grounds. The distance between where he stands and the threshold of the administration building is mere yards, yet it represents the largest gap in American society. Why would one individual choose to stand here? What drives a person to place his own body in the path of a system designed to crush him? He adjusts his stance, breathes in the humid air, and stares directly at the massive wooden doors. He knows the weight of what he is attempting. He knows the history waiting inside. He leans forward, preparing to cross the line that has defined the borders of this state for a century. The question remains, is he prepared for the cost of the key he is about to turn? The discipline that anchored James Meredith did not begin in a classroom. It was forged in the cold, precise machinery of the United States Air Force. He spent years following orders, navigating global logistics, and mastering the mechanics of complex systems. He learned that a clear objective, pursued with unwavering consistency, could shift the trajectory of any operation. When he left the service, he brought that same tactical mindset into civilian life. He looked at the society around him and saw a landscape defined by artificial limits. He realized that the same systems of control he had operated within were now actively denying him access to the tools of knowledge. For others, the university was a destination. For Meredith, it was a tactical necessity. He recognized that education was the only weapon capable of dismantling the barriers placed before his community. He did not seek a comfortable life or a quiet path. He analyzed the university policies, documented the contradictions, and prepared his own paperwork with the precision of a field report. He chose his ground. He checked his resolve. He understood that the rejection he was about to face would not be an end, but the opening move in a conflict he had already decided to win. He would not just ask for entry, he would demand the right to learn. Meredith drafted the application with care, his handwriting steady and legible. He mailed the documents from a local post office, watching the envelope slide into the collection slot. For days, the house remained quiet. He checked the mailbox every afternoon, finding only circulars and local news. The university took its time, a calculated silence intended to signal indifference. When the letter finally arrived, it was thin and formal. He tore the edge, pulled out the single sheet of paper, and read the typed words. The refusal was absolute. It cited policy, referenced administrative guidelines, and offered no room for appeal. He stood in the hallway, the paper crisp against his palm. He had predicted this outcome, yet the finality of the ink on the page felt like a physical wall slammed shut. He did not crumple the letter. He did not pace. He simply folded the refusal and placed it in a secure folder alongside his service records. The system had spoken, and by doing so, it had confirmed his suspicions. The university was not a place of open inquiry, but a fortress of gatekeepers. Meredith looked at the closed door of his study. The rejection was not a failure. It was the trigger he had been waiting for. The engagement had begun. The rejection was only the beginning of the paperwork. Meredith gathered his evidence, the correspondence with the university, and his own records, and walked into a law office. He did not ask for favors. He asked for a challenge to the system. They drafted the lawsuit, a document that turned his individual struggle into a formal, legal collision. The initial filing landed on the clerk's desk with a sharp thud. The university responded with a wall of procedural delays, filing motions to dismiss and requests for stays, hoping to exhaust his resources and his will. Every hearing was a battle of attrition. Meredith sat in the wooden pews of the courthouse, listening to arguments that sought to maintain the status quo through technicalities. He watched the lawyers pace, their voices echoing against the high ceilings, debating the legitimacy of his claim. The case moved upward, from lower courts to larger chambers. With every appeal, the stakes expanded. What started as one man seeking admission became a direct confrontation with the state's authority to exclude. He tracked the progress of the filings, noting the dates and the names of the judges. The legal machinery was slow, grinding forward with heavy, deliberate force. He was no longer just an applicant. He was the center of a mounting constitutional investigation that demanded an answer from the highest authorities in the land. The final stage of the legal battle arrived within the hushed, marble chambers of the Supreme Court. Meredith waited outside the courtroom, his hands clasped behind his back, listening to the muffled cadence of legal arguments. Inside, the justices weighed the contradiction between state law and federal mandate. The air in the corridor felt stagnant, heavy with the tension of a verdict that would echo across the entire nation. Then, the double doors swung open. A clerk emerged, carrying the written decision. The ruling was direct and unequivocal. The court affirmed Meredith's right to attend, striking down the university's discriminatory barriers. The ink on the final decree effectively dismantled the legal foundation of the university's exclusion. For a brief, singular moment, the path ahead seemed clear. The courtroom emptied, and the sound of footsteps on stone replaced the tension of the trial. Meredith held the document, the weight of the paper grounding him. This was the victory he had pursued through every hearing and motion. It was a win on paper, a clear directive from the highest authority in the land. Yet, as he stepped out into the daylight, he sensed the shifting wind. The law had spoken, but the ground was already beginning to tremble in anticipation of the resistance to come. The Supreme Court order arrived in Mississippi like a spark in a dry field. Within hours, the State House became a command center for resistance. Governor Ross Barnett stood before the cameras, his face set in a mask of rigid determination. He did not acknowledge the federal mandate. Instead, he invoked the doctrine of interposition, declaring the state's absolute authority to ignore the court. His words broadcasted across every radio and television, turning the legal victory into a direct challenge against federal power. Across the state, local officials began to organize. They did not just disagree with the ruling. They actively dismantled the mechanisms of compliance. They issued new directives, closed offices, and mobilized local police to stand as a barrier between the university gates and the outside world. The atmosphere in the capital turned thick with a new, aggressive energy. It was no longer a matter of policy. It was a matter of total defiance. Meredith watched the reports from his home, seeing the lines being drawn on a map. Every phone call he received was now a warning. The state was preparing to treat the federal order as an act of foreign aggression. The constitutional crisis had officially begun, and the silence of the law was replaced by the noise of an uprising. The defiance in Mississippi could not be ignored. Reports reached the White House, detailing the systematic blockade of federal authority. President John F. Kennedy sat at his desk. The papers from the Justice Department spread before him like a map of a coming conflict. He did not hesitate. He picked up the pen, his movements deliberate and sharp, and signed the executive order to federalize the Mississippi National Guard. The order stripped the state of its control, placing the troops directly under federal command. In the halls of the Pentagon and at regional bases, the response was immediate. Maps were marked, radios crackled with new instructions, and vehicles were fueled for departure. The shift was absolute. What had been a local political maneuver was now a national imperative. Federal marshals began their preparations to secure the campus, knowing the state would not yield without a struggle. Tension coiled through the corridors of power, tightening with every report of massing crowds near the university gates. The government was no longer just issuing decrees. It was moving pieces on a board. Thousands of miles away, the campus stood quiet, unaware that the machinery of the entire nation was now turning toward it, ready to force the issue of equality through the force of law. The 30th of September 1962. The dusk settled over the university campus, but the air held a metallic, static charge. Thousands had gathered, not for classes, but to block the path of progress. Federal marshals stood in a thin, rigid line, eyes scanning the growing mass of bodies. For a moment, there was only the sound of low, rhythmic chanting. Then, a single glass bottle shattered against the concrete. The sound acted as a trigger. A roar went up from the crowd, raw and uncoordinated. Bricks flew through the air, clattering against stone walls and hitting the pavement. The marshals held their formation as the perimeter collapsed under the weight of the surging mob. The campus was no longer a place of learning. It was a theater of raw, unfiltered aggression. Smoke from tear gas canisters began to curl through the trees, stinging the eyes of everyone caught in the fray. Cars were overturned, their metal frames groaning as they hit the asphalt. Fires flickered to life in the distance, casting long, frantic shadows against the historic buildings. The peaceful pursuit of education had been violently eclipsed, and the reality of the crisis was now broadcast to a horrified nation. There was no going back. The campus was now a war zone. Floodlights aimed at the administration building were shot out, plunging the scene into a jagged, strobe-lit nightmare. Federal marshals moved in tight clusters, their backs to the brick walls, coughing as thick clouds of tear gas swirled in the humid night air. Every few seconds, the rhythmic thud of projectiles hitting the ground punctuated the chaotic shouting. The mob surged forward, emboldened by the darkness, throwing heavy debris that crunched against the stone architecture. A marshal raised his hand to signal a shift in position, but his movement was cut short by a barrage of stones. They retreated inch by inch, their faces tight with the strain of holding a line that was rapidly dissolving. Gunfire echoed from the perimeter, sharp and sudden, signaling that the protest had crossed into lethal territory. The lawn, once groomed for scholarly pursuits, was now trampled into a muddy, debris-strewn trench. There was no strategy left, only the desperate attempt to keep the perimeter from collapsing entirely. The sound of shouting blended with the roar of engines as vehicles were ignited, their flames licking the dark sky. The future of civil rights was being contested on this patch of ground, where every step forward was met with the blunt, crushing force of resistance. The gunfire stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving a hollow, ringing silence in its wake. On the pavement near the main entrance, two bodies lay still, their forms stark against the debris-littered ground. The shouting died down, replaced by a low, collective murmur of disbelief. Nearby, a student clutched a bleeding arm, leaning heavily against a marble column, his eyes wide with the sudden intrusion of mortality. The air, heavy with the scent of gunpowder and burning rubber, felt suddenly thin. Marshals stood frozen in place, their weapons lowered, the reality of the night shifting from a tactical confrontation to a tragedy. Hundreds of others were scattered across the lawn, many limping or doubled over, nursing wounds from stones and shrapnel. The scale of the damage was now undeniable. A medic knelt in the mud, his hands stained dark, frantically attempting to stop the flow of blood from a fallen man. There was no victory here, only the grim tally of lives shattered in the pursuit of a change that had proven far more costly than anyone dared to imagine. The campus, once a bastion of tradition, was now defined by the blood on its soil. While the campus smoldered under the weight of the night's brutality, one figure remained detached from the chaos. James Meredith stood in a temporary holding area, watching the flickers of distant flames dance against the architecture. The air around him was thick with the acrid smell of smoke, yet he did not flinch or turn away. He gripped the edge of a wooden table, his knuckles white, channeling the turbulence of the riot into a singular, unwavering point of focus. Every shout from the perimeter and every siren wailing in the distance failed to penetrate his calm. He checked his watch, then adjusted his position, standing straighter despite the exhaustion heavy in his limbs. The world outside the room was fractured by fire and conflict, but he was a pillar of absolute, quiet defiance. He did not look at the blood-stained grass or the broken glass underfoot as signs of defeat. Instead, he saw them as markers of a threshold he was determined to cross. His breathing remained slow, deliberate, and rhythmic. He was not waiting for the violence to end. He was waiting for the moment he could finish what he had started. The carnage had failed to break his mandate. He was ready. Dawn light bled across the university grounds, revealing the scarred landscape left by the night. Broken glass crunched under the heavy boots of the federal marshals as they tightened their formation. James Meredith stepped out from the vehicle, his movements measured and precise. He looked ahead toward the main administrative building, ignoring the remnants of debris scattered across his path. The guards flanking him kept their eyes scanning the perimeter, hands hovering near their holsters. The tension in the air was palpable, a sharp contrast to the morning stillness. Meredith began to walk. Each step was deliberate, his heels striking the pavement with a rhythmic clarity that cut through the silence. He did not veer to avoid the dark stains on the walkway or the twisted metal of the overturned barricades. He kept his gaze fixed firmly on the doorway ahead. As he approached the threshold, he slowed his pace, feeling the weight of the air shifting around him. He moved past the boundary line where the past ended and the future began. The distance between the entrance and his goal vanished with every stride. He reached the heavy oak doors, placed a steady hand against the wood, and prepared to enter. The office was quiet, a vacuum of sound compared to the chaos outside. James Meredith walked to the counter, his boots echoing on the hardwood floor. A clerk sat behind a stack of thick ledgers, eyes darting from Meredith to the two federal marshals standing directly behind him. The clerk's hands paused over a pile of forms. No one spoke. Meredith reached out and slid a set of documents toward the edge of the desk. The clerk looked at the federal agents, then back at the inkwell, and finally pulled the papers forward. A fountain pen was placed on the blotter. Meredith took the pen. The metal was cold against his fingertips. He felt the weight of every law, every rejection, and every threat channeled into his wrist as he leaned over the desk. He pressed the nib into the paper. The ink flowed, dark and permanent, forming the letters of his name. With that single signature, the barrier that had stood for decades fractured. He handed the pen back, the transaction complete. The clerk looked down at the entry, then up at him, and for the first time, the institutional mask of denial slipped. Meredith stepped back, the registration form now a matter of record. James Meredith stepped back out into the hallway, the ink on his registration form still damp. The atmosphere outside the office had changed. The news of his presence had traveled, and the silence now held a different quality, a realization that the fortress had been breached. He walked toward the exit, flanked by his guards, moving through the very halls that had officially declared him an impossibility. Students stood in the doorways, watching him pass. No one moved to block him. The physical reality of his presence forced a confrontation that no legal brief or court order could replicate. People who had built their lives on the premise of exclusion were forced to look at the man who had erased their boundary with a signature. The university was no longer a closed system. The wall had been cracked wide open. Outside, the news reached the gates, rippling across the state and into the national consciousness. Television cameras fixed their lenses on the doorway as he emerged into the daylight. The institution remained, but its foundation was fundamentally altered. History had shifted under the weight of a single steady stride, and the nation was now looking through the gap he had forced open. The era of unchecked institutional exclusion had met its match. The roar of the protest faded into a dull, persistent hum of hostility that followed James Meredith everywhere. Registration was merely the beginning of a different kind of challenge. He walked across the campus, the ground beneath his feet feeling like shifting sand. Every morning began the same way. A heavy knock at the door, the presence of his security detail, and the walk toward buildings that felt colder with each passing day. He entered rooms where the air seemed to thin as he crossed the threshold. Chairs scraped against floorboards, moving away from him, creating a perimeter of empty space that no one would cross. When he sat, the lecture hall did not become quiet. It became suffocating. He watched the back of the student in front of him, tracking the tension in their shoulders. No one spoke to him. No one looked him in the eye. It was a calculated, systematic erasure. The riot had been a physical assault, but this was a war of attrition. He learned to count the seconds between the professor's questions, the rhythmic tap of a pencil, and the stifled whispers that circled the room like ghosts. He was the only person in the room who understood that every minute he remained seated was a victory against the silence intended to break him. The heavy door clicked shut, sealing the classroom. Yet the presence of the two federal marshals remained a constant, disruptive weight near the back wall. James Meredith walked to his assigned desk, the sound of his footsteps magnified by the deliberate silence of 50 other students. He sat. The marshals shifted their stance, their eyes scanning the room, turning a space of learning into a guarded perimeter. At the front, the professor stood motionless for a long beat before beginning the lecture. His voice carefully neutral, his gaze never once drifting toward the back of the room. Meredith opened his notebook. He felt the heat of dozens of eyes boring into the side of his face. A student 2 rows ahead leaned away, deliberately widening the distance between them. He ignored the movement. He focused entirely on the professor's words, pen poised to capture every detail. When he wrote, the scratch of his nib against the paper sounded like a thunderclap in the room. This was the front line now. No shouting, no fire, just the slow, grinding pressure of isolation. He kept his spine straight, his breathing steady, and his attention fixed forward. Every word he transcribed onto the page was a deliberate act of defiance against the expectation that he would eventually walk away. The final semester dragged with the same heavy, suffocating weight that had defined his arrival. But then, the last examination ended. James Meredith laid his pen down on the desk, the sound echoing in the now familiar quiet of the hall. He stood up, gathered his belongings, and walked toward the professor's desk to submit his paper. For the first time, there was no hostility in the movement, only the stark reality of a task completed. He had arrived. He had stayed. He had endured. Months of isolation, the constant shadow of federal guards, and the crushing pressure to retreat had failed to break his resolve. The graduation day arrived in 1963 with the sun bright against the brick walls of the university. He moved through the crowd, steady and focused. As he approached the podium, when his name was called, the air in the stadium shifted. He walked forward to accept his degree in political science, his hand closing firmly around the parchment. This was not merely the end of a course of study. It was the empirical proof that entrenched opposition could be weathered. He stood before the crowd, a singular figure who had forced the institution to recognize his right to exist there. The walk across the stage was brief, but it carried the weight of every step he had taken since that first day at the gate. The diploma in his hand was more than paper. It was a physical key that had unlocked a rusted gate. For decades, the university had been a fortress of exclusion, a place where the architecture itself seemed designed to repel anyone who looked like him. Meredith had not just walked through that gate, he had held it open. Behind him, the path he carved became a thoroughfare. He changed the fundamental character of the institution, forcing it to acknowledge that the pursuit of knowledge could no longer be shackled by the color of a student's skin. Every student who walked onto that campus after him, regardless of their background, did so because the pressure he exerted had permanently altered the hinges of the doors. He had transformed the university from a bastion of resistance into a site of potential. The impact was not a quiet change. It was a seismic shift in the culture of American higher education. He proved that an individual could stand against the weight of a state, against the inertia of tradition, and win. His legacy was etched into the very stones of the quadrangle, a reminder that the most rigid structures are susceptible to the force of a single, resolute will. He cleared the brush for a generation to walk through, ensuring that his presence was not an anomaly, but the beginning of a new, inevitable standard. The history of the gate is not written in stone, but in the choices we make today. James Meredith proved that courage can force a door open, but keeping it open requires a collective, unrelenting vigilance. We look at our institutions now, and we must see beyond the surface of progress. Who is still waiting outside? Who remains locked out by the invisible barriers of our current systems? The bravery of one man ignited a movement, yet the journey toward true equality is a relay, not a sprint. It demands that we identify the thresholds that are still guarded by indifference and challenge them with the same grit that carried Meredith across the campus in 1962. His life is a mirror held up to every classroom, every boardroom, and every public space. We are the architects of the next threshold. We must ask ourselves if we have the resolve to dismantle the remaining walls and ensure that the path to knowledge and opportunity is accessible to all. The work is not finished. It resides in the next step, the next voice, and the next person willing to stand firm when the world demands they retreat. The door is standing open. The question is, who will walk through it next, and who among us will hold it steady for them,